Hello, I'm Jim Gibney and welcome to a special edition of The Conversation, where we take an alternative look at political events and current affairs around Ireland. This week we take a look at the 1981 hunger strike. Much has been written about this tumultuous period in our history. But one area which has not received much attention is the communication system used by both the leadership of Sinn Féin on the outside and the prisoners on the inside. But before I speak to my next guest, let's get a quick overview on this week's topic. So let's introduce today's guests. Joining me today is Tom Hartley, who's in charge of the POW department and organised the communication system from the outside. I'm also joined today by former political prisoner Seanna Walsh, who can speak authoritatively about the communication from inside the H-Blocks during the hunger strike of 1981. And firstly then over to Tom. So Tom, first of all, why was there a communication system needed and when did you put it together? When did you organise it?
Well, of course, the prison authorities done all in their power to close down the communications between the prisoners and the outside. And that meant, of course, that there wasn't a flow and it was often difficult to get information in and out of the jail. And of course, men and women in the Armagh, they were locked away, they were on strike, they were on the no wash. And all of these conditions made it difficult to have a flow of information in and out of the jail, or indeed all of it made it difficult to have a flow of communications. So I was appointed head of the POW department sometime, I think about, was 1979, 1980. And of course, the context for all of this is a very deepening crisis in the H-Blocks and Armagh Women's Prison. And so I was appointed as the chair of the POW department, and the first thing I set myself to do was to create a communications between us outside and the prisoners inside, because it was obvious that we needed a flow of information, because the period we were going through was, it was a deep political crisis.
When you say a crisis, what exactly do you mean in terms of how many prisoners were you dealing with on the inside in the H-Blocks and in Armagh Women's Prison?
Well, I think by that time there was a few hundred. Remember, there was always an increasing number of prisoners, and it was never a static number. And so you had the prisoners in the H-Blocks and the women in Armagh jail. And but what was really going on was this big, crisis inside the jails. And it was really imperative that the leadership outside had an understanding of the conditions inside, what the Republican prisoners were enduring, what was happening to them, you know, and what was happening to them on a daily basis. So I went then to see Maura McCrory, and Maura was in charge of the Relatives Action Committee. And so I explained to Maura what was required in terms of communication. Now, Maura then went to the Relatives Action Committee, and the Relatives Action Committee was made up of the girlfriends, mothers, sisters, grandmothers of the prisoners. And so Maura then brought me back a list of those who were going in to visit. So that was really the start of a process where we could determine who was going to what block, who was going to Armagh, and then we started to build this communication network with the prisoners. And in time, of course, the prisoners then sent us the what visits they were taking. So, in fact, there was a coordinated approach between ourselves and the prisoners to create this flow of information and flow of comms in and out of the jails.
That might be a good point to bring Seanna in to explain from the inside, the prison point of view, why it was important that there was this flow of information from inside to outside.
I would have to actually go back a wee bit because whenever the protest started in September '76 with Keir Nugent, the vast majority of the prisoners who ended up in the protest refused to take visits because it meant that you would have to wear a prison uniform. So what that then meant was that people didn't know what was happening outside because our letters were being censored, heavily censored, and any information that we could get out usually was word of mouth through the priests who were coming in. Or when we shared it across, you met people from, if you had to go to the hospital or you had to go on appeals or, you know, to go back to court, things like that. That is the only time that you would actually come across other prisoners and be able to get the word out. So it was late '77, early '78, when Brenton Hughes and the team came down from the cages, having lost their status as a result of an incident that happened, a bit of a row with the prison warders in the cages. And they landed down into the blocks. And one of the first things that the Dark made clear to people was that people outside didn't know what was going on inside the prisons. They didn't know about the brutality and the deprivation that we were enduring. And so he also initiated a discussion and a debate about the future of the protest. And that actually started then on March 1978. What actually happened was when we took the decision to take visits, it meant that you were coming into more and more contact with the prison warders. And the prison warders resented the fact that we were taking visits, and they stepped up the harassment and the brutality, which then led in turn to us beginning to escalate the protest within the jail, which in turn led to further escalation of the brutality. And we ended up on the No Wash protest. We used to take visits with a simple objective of getting the word out of what was happening within the prisons. It was only later then that we decided that we were going to have to organise it in some better fashion, because initially it was very haphazard. You took visits whenever you wanted to take them or whenever it suited your family. We decided that we would have to start taking a more strategic approach to it, because we needed to spread the visits out, whereby we were trying to cover every single day that there would be visits out from every wing and visits, you know, making contact with not only our visitors, but also making contact with prisoners from the other blocks.
So there's an awareness on the inside that there has to be a much more coordinated approach to get the information outside to Tom and to the party leadership. And then, so Tom, what then happens with this system? You've got a group of women who are basically organised around yourself. What then begins to take shape in terms of the structure? of the communication
First
system?
of all, it's a very simple system. You know, there's nothing extraordinary about it other than there were visits, and then the prisoners were sending out their information, and we were sending in information. So once that was established, that really took off and just worked on its own. And that was a pattern, you know, that's right through the hunger strikes and right beyond the hunger strikes, that this communication trail was established and then worked. But from early on, certainly when I started to communicate with the prisoners, one of the first things I did was to send in a note, quite a lengthy note, to say, look, you need then to start to write to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope, the Taoiseach, your GAA clubs, your youth clubs, your women's movement, any social connection that was in existence needed to get a note or a letter from a H-Block prisoner or a woman in Armagh. And in essence, what then happened was, so prisoners, of course, were on the inside, you might say, you know, really at the coalface of the struggle. But then the role as communicating their conditions to the outside world really externalised the role, you know, so it wasn't that this was an internalised role of prisoners by and large watching what was happening to their comrades in hunger strike. I think suddenly prisoners had this very structured view of what they needed to do to inform the world. You know that old Republican saying, there's no use doing it if you don't tell the world. So the prisoners told the world by sending out their comms. Now, the effect of the comms, I think, was probably very devastating on people, because it wasn't that they're getting a nice letter from a prisoner in prison notepaper. They were getting a note, very small writing, cigarette paper, smuggled out of the block, okay? And you could smell the prison. You could smell the prison of these comms. And they were sent out in their thousands. And I think the impact of getting a small cigarette paper really impacted on the receiver. And so that then, and that continued right through the protest, right through the hunger strike and beyond the hunger strike. You know, that this flow of information. But as I said, for me, what it did is that, in a sense, it externalised the role of the prisoner.
And it also broke through the information gap or the ignorance that there was on the outside about what life was like in the H-Blocks and in Armagh Women's Prison in terms of the coverage of it at that time in the mainstream media.
Well, it was like a flood out. And I often think, you know, so what was required was cigarette papers, what was required was small pencils, and what was required was cling film. And I always said to people that the small pencils of the bookies of the north of Ireland suddenly disappeared, because they were all flown into the blocks,
the prisons,
in Armagh Women's Prison. And so the same with clingfill, because they would be wrapped up in clingfill, and so the clingfill would be recycled. And then as I said, then the cigarette papers, and it was extraordinary what could be got, what a narrative could be found in a cigarette paper. And the cigarette papers become the narrative in themselves, because they stand out really, I think, as a testament to the efforts of prisoners to break the strategy of isolation that was imposed on the prisoners by the prison authorities.
So, Seanna, in terms of inside the prison, who was coordinating that huge effort that Tom is describing?
Well, it would actually have to go back before the hunger strikes again, and in the sense that late 79, there was a push on by the prisoners for a hunger strike. It was actually at the time of the Pope visiting Ireland in October 79, the Pope came. But before that, there had been the intention to launch a hunger strike. And what then happened was that after some very forthright discussion with the leadership on the outside. The prisoners, they agreed to defer the protest, the hunger strike, and to engage in a whole propaganda campaign, basically, of information, as relayed by Tom there, that we then began to write to everybody that we could think of. Trade unions, GAA groups, credit union organisations, community groups, anybody who we thought would give us an ear. We also wrote to all sorts of politicians, both foreign and domestic. We wrote to any sort of big personalities. Like I remember Bobby Sands talking about writing to Jane Fonda. And Jane Fonda actually made some comment in one of the Sunday papers about receiving this this calm from the prisons in Ireland and in Lancash. So we really sort of got stuck into that from about 1979, late 1979.
Do you think were the prison authorities aware of it, and did they increase their intimidation and searches in relation to that period?
Well, they had already introduced the mirror search, which was a very invasive search. We were already naked anyway, with just a blanket wrapped around your shoulders. But when you were going out on your visit, you were stripped naked. You were kicked into a squat over a mirror. So they used it as an excuse. Whenever you left your cell, the prison warders used that as an excuse to basically to rough you up.
There would have been hundreds of prisoners in at that stage in the blocks.
There would have been
Armagh Women's Prison.
There would have been round about the end of 79. There would have been around about 300, right? Whenever the hunger strike started, the first hunger strike started in October 1980. I think there were about 4,500 guys in the H-Blocks.
Right.
There were never more than, I believe, 35 women in Armagh.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I'm concerned, that's up to the women to tell the Armagh story.
In terms of then, because obviously I think Seanna was saying that there was phases to this. You know, there's this what he called the propaganda phase leading up to the hunger strike. And at that stage, the flow of information from your end into the prison was routine and in a way casual. But as the situation deteriorates in the prison, you then have the hunger strike of 1980 looming. What then happens to the system, the communication system?
Well, let me explain then how the communications were handled outside. First of all, we would send a communication in at 9:30 in the morning, and we're able to get an answer out by 12:30. And then we were able to send another communication in at about 2 o'clock and get a reply now by say 4 o'clock or 4:30. And that was fairly standard, you know, that once that was established, that was the pattern, you know, so we had very good communications. And then as we developed and as the crisis developed, there was small crystal radios sent in. Now, they were so small, but the benefit of the crystal radio was that the blocks were beside the BBC mast at Blair's, so they could pick up the news. So right. That was a help to them. So they were able to hear what was taking place, say, at the 11 o'clock news at night. And that was also an aid. Then we decided that we would miniaturize the infoblock. And they were about that size. And they were sent in. So there was an intense level of communication going in. Now, what would happen? There was, at one level, there was thousands of communications coming out. And we could not handle all the communications. So generally we handled the communications to the leadership of Sinn Féin coming out. And we had a room in 51 Falls Road. And so as the communications came out, they would all be sorted. And then we had a team that would write out and then type out on small brown sheets of paper what was in the comm. And these would be presented to the leadership once they were all typed up and ready, because it was very, very difficult at times to read constantly the communications. So these were all, at the end of the day, they would be handed to the leadership. And so, you know, there was always this update going on, always, you know, as the, you know, there were different moves aimed towards the prisoners. And so, you know, there'd be this constant communication.
So you were, the constant communication allowed the mind of the leadership and the mind of the leadership on the outside and the mind of the leadership on the inside to be at one in a way.
Yes,
to have the same view.
It was essential. It wasn't just the leadership. It was essential that prisoners knew what was taking place outside. It was essential that if there were any moves generated towards prisoners by, say, external bodies, you know, or political organisations, that the prisoners knew about it, and it was important that we on the outside understood prisoner thinking, because right throughout the period of the protest and the hunger strike, it was prisoner thinking that really determined how we on the outside responded to what was taking place.
And I'd like to sort of give you an idea of one of the things, one of the developments that there was in the jail at that time as well. That we discovered that if a prisoner was on appeal, that they were entitled to a daily visit, 15-minute visit, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. And this then proved invaluable. And some of these guys who were on appeal visits became one of the major sources of information from inside the prison, but also access to the leadership comms. And it has to be said too that while we maintained a very strong link with the leadership of, you know, the Relatives Action Committees, the National H-Block Armagh Committee, with the leadership of Sinn Féin, we also had a direct line to the IRA leadership, which was essential because at the end of the day, you know, we were IRA prisoners in the main. And, you know, one of the things that I always think about is the quote from Pat Sheehan. Pat Sheehan was on the hunger strike for 55 days. He was the longest prisoner on the hunger strike whenever the hunger strike was ended on the 3rd of October in 1981. And Pat talks about whenever he put his name down to go on the hunger strike, that he received a comm from the IRA, from the Army Council of the IRA, and what it stated on the comm, on the cover of the comm, the address of the comm, it said on it, Óglaach Pat Sheehan. And Pat was saying that, you know, the only time you ever see a reference to Óglaach, anybody, is on a gravestone. Mm-hmm. And he said that this had a very profound effect upon him when he received this comm from the council.
And do you recall the crystal radios coming into the prison? Was there one in your wing? The crystal radios, the introduction of the crystal radios was massive in the blocks, because up until then, the news that we got was through the visits, or the sort of weekly news that you would have got from the Republican News, whenever we were able to smuggle in. And the crystal sets really changed all that.
in that you were able to get a daily news every night. Now, as we got further into the hunger strike, and particularly as the situation became more and more intense, guys used to listen to the radios during the day. So you have cases where, and it was very dangerous to do that, in the sense that the prison warders could come and open your door at any time. But we were so hungry for news, so eager to keep on top of what was happening to our comrades in the hospitals, listening to any news of the various initiatives that we were getting. Thomas talked about the external groups who were coming up with ways of how to solve the hunger strike in terms of the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace. There was a delegation of southern MEPs came in. There were people come in from the Swiss Red Cross guys came in and visited us at one stage with, looking at different ways to resolve it. There was a constant flow of bishops, and the Pope actually sent an emissary across to try and resolve the hunger strike. So all of this was happening, and it was very important that we were able to listen to any of the developments as they were happening, not only what they were saying when they came into the jail, but what they were saying when they left the jail.
And what was the background to the crystal sets? Do you remember?
So an old comrade of mine, Seanna McVeigh, who R.I.P., who we both knew, Jim, he came up with the idea of, can we get some sort of a radio in the jail? Surely there's some sort of a radio with miniaturized batteries that you could get in and you could listen to the news and keep abreast of how things are going. And he mentioned this to a good friend of ours, Arthur Fagan. And Arthur, while he didn't have the wherewithal to produce this radio, he knew a guy who did. And he approached this guy and he spoke to him, and they come up with this crystal set. And the beauty of the crystal set was that it didn't need batteries. It worked, and I still don't know how it worked, but it worked by connecting one wire to the grill on the window, and the second wire was connected to the hot water pipes, the heating pipes in the cell. And there was an earpiece which fitted into your ear, and through that, as Tom said, you were able to pick up a signal from Glarus BBC mast.
So what that was the beneficial aspect of one aspect of this communication system, but the volume of comms that were going in and out of the prison itself suggested that you would have needed quite a body of people working on your behalf, on behalf of the prisoners.
Well, I would like to pay tribute to the hundreds of women who brought the comms into the jails and brought them out again. And then there's women like Mary Moore, late Maggie McCulloch, who did amazing work in that period, and were there on the visits. And I mean, going on a visit at a time wasn't very easy. It was highly emotional, going into that setting, particularly during the hunger strikes. And yet, the simplicity of that structure was built on the efforts of hundreds of women who were carrying the comms into the jails where you found Republicans. And in a sense, that's the base. The apex of that triangle is the comm being delivered to a prisoner. But the base is very broad. And it reflected, I think, the participation of a big broad base during the hunger strike itself. And in every sense, I want to pay tribute to those countless women who, week after week, and gone up to visit their sons or their daughters or their sisters or, their husbands.
And Seanna, did the communication system itself, did it make an intolerable situation on the inside easier to manage, the knowledge that people knew on the outside what was happening to us before the hunger strike began?
Well, it meant that what we were enduring was made known to people outside in general. You know, the idea of suffering in silence may well be, you know, something to be admired, but it wasn't what the protest was about. And I think it was Tom said earlier on that there's an Irish saying that there's no sense in doing something if you don't tell the world about it.
And remember, Jim, if you're not seen, you're not heard. And the comms were the manifestation of prisoners being seen.
And just finally then on the importance of the comms. And I think in this book, 10 Men Dead by David Beresford, the book is based on the comms that survive on the outside, and the story about the hunger strikes in Armagh Women's Prison, both hunger strikes in the H-Blocks and the deaths of the 10 lads are reflected in this book. So you can see the importance of them in that regard. But I was just wondering, just what happened to the comms, the ones that survived? Where are they today?
The bulk of them are in the National Library in Dublin.
Yes, and they will be available to be seen at some point?
Yes, but they're being, I think, digitised at the minute because they're in a very vulnerable state. Because they're very flimsy, you know, but they'd be in a very, but they tell their own story of, you know, what was going on. But they also, when you read them, tell the story of the attitude of prisoners, of their morale, you know, of their sense of themselves as a group. There's so many dimensions of the H-Block and Armagh story that are contained in those comms.
And I suppose when reading the comms, and then when you read Beresford's book and the comms, you see the intensity and also the bravery and heroism of the prisoners in the H-Blocks and Armagh Women's Prison in the most difficult circumstances and what they're experiencing.
And oddly, one of the things you comes across very strong is the humanity of the prisoners, because the humour that is contained in those comms, you know, and it could be often described as black humour, but it's truly amazing, you know, and it's it's not of a defeated group, anything but it's people with ideas, people with a vision, you know, they have a sense of their purpose, and it all comes through in the comms.
And the comms recorded that historic period in our history.
Well, the comms did indeed record that whole period from start to finish and even beyond. But one of the things you have to realise too is that all of the comms did not survive in the way that Tom's talking about there in the National Museum. There are people who have dozens of comms themselves in their own homes. I remember being at an event in South Armagh a couple of years ago with Jim McCann was doing a book launch, the time that Jazz McCann wrote the book about his experiences in prison. And a friend of ours came up and said, "Will you see this?" And he pulled a comm out, which was written by Bobby Sands and which had been given to him by some local guy. And he didn't really know where it had came from or who the comm was written to. It was like a general comm that Bobby sent round the wings, and someone had managed to sort of keep that. And it always reminds me of an occasion when we were in H6 at the time, during the hunger strike, after Bobby had died, and a comm came in from the leadership on the outside, and I read the comm to the wing that I was in, and then at Mass on Sunday I was given the comm to Larry Marley and asked him to read it out to the guys in his wing. And I told him, whenever you finish with that, destroy it. And he said to me, "Are you mad?" He says, "That's our history. That's our history." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He says, "I save them and then I send them out, and that's all. That's to record the story of the H-Blocks.
So the comms not only helped during that period of time, communication from the outside leadership to the inside leadership, but they continue to play a part in recording that historical period in our history.
Well, by their very nature.
By the
very nature they do that. I mean, I don't think the Republican prisoners were sitting down writing columns saying, this is going to be the historical record. All they were doing was relating the conditions of their lives that existed, and the conditions that existed in the jails, and they were telling us about their worries and their worries about the politics of the time or what they thought of it. There's so many dimensions to it.
Well, look, I'd like to thank you both for speaking about this period in our history and bringing your own personal experience to the conversation. Almost 45 years ago now, and I think without a doubt, you can see the importance of the communication system that was put in place both on the inside and on the outside, and the contribution it is continuing to make in terms of the history of that period, particularly for people, young people interested in that historic period in our struggle for freedom and independence. And that does it for another week. We'd love for you to join the conversation by sharing the link to today's programme to help us grow our audience across our social media platforms. I'd once again like to thank our special guests Tom Hartley and Seanna Walsh. In the meantime, the conversation will be back next week with more investigations and analysis. I'm Jim Gibney. Slán an fhís. Bye for now.